Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for yet another receivables info webinar. Today, I'm here with two good friends, Mr. Mark Naiman and Katalina Dawson, here to talk to us a little bit about getting the most for your conferences. As frequent conference attendees, and Mark as the owner of some conferences, we do spend a ridiculous amount of time on the road attending shows around the industry and around adjacent industries, that settlement, creditors, etc. But as we kind of kick off our discussion today, one, I'd like to ask anybody who has any comments. This is the first time we're kind of running that intro video at the beginning. I think it's kind of cool. Would love to hear your thoughts about it. But just to kind of kick off our discussion today, Katalina, could you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat you're in today?
Absolutely. So I would consider myself still relatively new to the receivables management industry. I've been here about 3 years at this point, 2 with a company called Prodigal and 1 with Branding Arc I just hit my 1 year actually I'm going to hit my 1 year like this next Monday. So I'm very thrilled to be here. I have a background in events. That's actually how I got into this industry, is doing events management and events planning. So I'm super excited for this topic.
Mr. Naiman, I feel like a man that needs no introduction, but let's do the short version.
Hello, Mark Naiman. Started a debt buying company with a former partner 20+5 years ago. Retired in 2020 to take over 2 trade shows that have run concurrently in the space. One being CRS, the other DCS, and having gone from the speaker, sponsor, exhibitor, attendee side of things, and then now being responsible for delivering on that experience for the people that I've grown to know and love within the collection space is my new calling. That's my 30-second pitch.
I like it. I think it's a good 30-second pitch. Someday we'll have to do a 5-minute pitch.
Ooh,
joke there.
Good. I like that.
Just for anybody, if I have any internet glitches today, I do apologize. I'm down in Campo Grande, Brazil. I do see one of our Brazilian friends is actually attending the webinar today, so hello. But if anybody has any questions as we're going through our discussion today, please just drop it in the chat. Like, if we can turn this into more of a discussion and add some additional value, I think that's our favorite way to do these kinds of things. So to kick off our discussion today, I know that we've got a deck and we can kind of walk through some of the things that we had planned for today. But right before we jumped on and started recording today, we were having a really interesting conversation about events and kind of categorizing the way that we look at events that I think is worth continuing prior to jumping into a deck, because I think it was a more important discussion. And what we were talking about is we were kind of comparing the types of conferences, and I don't mean the disciplines that the different associations represent, but more from a perspective of, for example, Debt Connection Symposium, which is coming up the first week of October, is a conference that has, over the last 2 years, been in the same location, but is known as a conference that moves around. And so the last couple of years, we've been out in Las Vegas at the Red Rock. Now we're going to be in New Orleans at the Four Seasons. I've never been to New Orleans before, but the point here is that that's the kind of conference that starts to move around and that you're not always fully aware of what the venue is going to be when you get there. In contrast, both Mark and I have served as the president of RMAI and have been going to that show since it's been at the Aria. Next year, we're always at the Aria. And it's a little bit of a different planning curve. I know exactly where I'm going to go have dinner. I know exactly where I'm going to be hanging out. I know exactly how to get to my room, to the conference floor, where I should consider having, private meetings. And I know Sylvia's on, so I will throw the plug in. If you're going to do private meetings, definitely look at the executive lounge. That's a great space so that you're not always running around trying to find a seat. Having that space, I think, is important, but that feeds to my point that I think it's, because I've been to the Aria so many times, it's more predictable for us and it's a little bit easier for us to plan. I'm going to kick this out. I just wanted to kind of lay the foundation for that. But Mark, Catalina, from your perspective, how do you treat those two types of events differently as an attendee?
Yeah. So personally speaking, and speaking from personal experience, 20 years of attending these shows, I think that there's always this careful balance between a destination location, someplace new. I think that associations have really captured that. I mean, again, speaking to RMAI, something like the executive retreat, where you're constantly moving, it's created as a destination conference. It, to me, in my opinion, leads to a different and more intimate experience. RMAI at the Aria, and by the way, the Aria is a gorgeous property. I think the only negative thing is that it's in Las Vegas. And I think that for those that have been in the space for 20 years, there's a fatigue that takes place. Look, I'll be totally honest. Whether it was Caesars or Paris or any of the other prior homes of that particular conference, Aria hits on so many of the points because it allows for all of the things that you've mentioned, private meeting spaces. And again, they do a great job. As you mentioned, the executive meeting lounge keeps people together, which is a critical component of being successful at any conference. And in my opinion, the smaller the show, the easier it is to maintain that attendee experience.
For me, a lot of that comes with planning. You've got to consider all of the different aspects. So the Aria, we know where to go at this point. For me, I'm going on my 4th year going to RMAI annual. So I know where to go. I know where to be. I know how far my hotel room is going to be. So if I have business cards in there, I know, okay, I need to bring this many business cards because I can't get back to my hotel room between sessions and things like that. When I go to a different one, you're going in blind most of the time. Sometimes you get the maps, which can be a little bit helpful, but we all know when you look at those maps and then you're there in person, it can be a whole different beast. So trying to get a little bit of pre-planning when you arrive, go check out the registration desk, see where it is. But even before that, and this is something I mentioned when we were chatting right before this started, is the planning of travel. Because if you've never been to a city before, you don't know how far that venue is from the airport. So just even knowing, okay, how long is it going to take me to get to the venue? And then how long is it going to take me to get back? Because like we just had ACA in San Diego, the airport was like 10 minutes away. It was fabulous. There was no rush, no stress really getting back out and missing flights potentially. But I was in Duluth, Georgia, outside of Atlanta for another event earlier this year, where it was about an hour away from the venue. And then add on to that, the time that we ended was peak traffic. So it went from being an hour to an hour and a half, maybe even closer to 2 hours. And somebody in our Uber almost missed their flight. So just being able to look at those things and try to understand what's going on with the new location will help you immensely. Hopefully you don't miss flights because that's one of the biggest headaches with travel.
So just to kind of add on that, making sure that even you're going to the right airport. And I did this for the RMEI Executive Summit this year, where everybody flew into Albuquerque. I just looked at the location and went, ooh, Santa Fe. And I flew into Santa Fe, which has 2 gates, right? And so I got onto the smallest regional jet I've ever been on in my life, where I had to like put my bag next to me because there was no overhead bins. But like that was a kind of a big mistake on my part, right? And a different layer of research that I should have spent my time and energy doing. I ended up being about the same distance away from the facility, but never considered the massive difference in airport size between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Not to say Albuquerque is a large airport, but Santa Fe might be the smallest one I've ever been to. Uh, so just something to consider as you're looking at those. And for me, it's about exploring a new city. So I love going to a new place. I'm really looking forward to going to DCS and going to New Orleans for the first time. But the first thing that I do in planning for that is I go to TripAdvisor. And I know that probably sounds silly, and that's how maybe some people are planning vacations. But no matter if I'm going to a new city for the first time, that is the first place that I go to establish. I literally go to the restaurants and I search from one down, and I go, where are we having? How far are these from the facility, and where are we going to be having our meals? Because to me, that's the number one thing that I'm concerned about at a conference is who am I breaking bread with and where? Because that's where relationships are built. And I'll use kind of a funny story from the summit in Albuquerque recently. I went out with a bunch of friends, including Mark and some of our other close friends, to Dion's Pizza. Like that was our outbound for the night, right? And it was very much like a 1990s Pizza Hut. I really wish I had the book it pin, and I would have felt
limited. Options are limited.
But in saying that, we had a great time. We created new experiences. We went out for dessert after, right? Like we created an experience out of it. And that was, for me, one of the most important parts of even attending that conference was those personal social interactions that create those shared experiences. And a shared experience is ultimately how you build friendships in some way, shape, or form. And that shared experience could be golfing. That shared experience could be having a meal together. It could be hanging out between sessions. It could be smoking around the ashtray for the smokers. And I can't even count how many friends I've created when I was a smoker. But looking at it from that perspective, I think that there's some real opportunity to create the shared experience.
And trying to also capitalize. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kat. No, you start.
Trying to also just capitalize on what makes that area special. So in New Orleans, do something with a jazz band, do something New Orleans-y. Or in San Diego, we went on a cruise because you can't go on a cruise everywhere. You can't do that in Santa Fe. So just focusing on what makes that area special can even make those excursions way more significant and stand out.
I wanted to kind of spin back to the thing that you have right on the top of this first slide, Adam, which is which shows make sense for my business? Because, we could talk about all the shows, and there's probably 20, 30 shows. That's debt buying, that's collections, that's affiliated, whether it's auto or debt settlement or HFMA or all of these, even the big shows, right? Like the Money 2020s have become popular over the last 5 or 10 years. But, right, these are all much different shows. For me, speaking from a private business perspective, there were 2 reasons I went to every show. One, meaningful, new or existing maintenance of existing relationships. And number 2, the education. All of the other stuff that comes along, especially with the nonprofit associations, whether it's the fundraising or this or that can all be done outside of a conference venue. And while there's always a good mean to kind of do things like the silent auction, right? These things really drive positive things. I don't think that's why people are going to the show, right? That's kind of a byproduct of attending the show. And so, from a business perspective, I think it's important to identify, hey, how can we best align with the attendees that are going to the show that's coming up? And I know it's in a slide or 2, but we'll start talking about attendee lists. Are attendee lists provided to all attendees in advance of shows? In my experience, it's typically provided to sponsors and exhibitors in advance of conferences, and attendees will typically receive one, maybe not, after the conference concludes. So how does one company go about best aligning with the companies that are coming or potentially might be coming to a particular conference?
I think it's a lot about selecting your conferences based on the mix of people that are going to be there. What makes sense for me, right? If I collect on healthcare debt, I'm probably not going to the auto shows or the fintech shows, right? But if I'm a debt buyer, I'm more likely to be going to shows that are, fintech based, right? It's just kind of the way of the world in providing those opportunities. And what level of attendance am I going to do? And this goes back, I mean, this plays right into the attendee list as well, is am I going to sponsor, exhibit, attend, or am I going to be the ever hated lounge lizard? Right.
That's not a
and
level of attendance. That's a level of avoidance.
So let's talk about what that is for a minute, because I can tell you personally, like, I will never take a meeting with someone who's not registered for a conference ever. I'll cancel it standing there in front of them if they're not there to participate in the conference itself. And honestly, I lose a lot of respect for those people. I don't know how anybody else feels. Well, Mark, I know how you feel about it, but generally speaking, I will call those people out. I also try and make it a point to meet all of my meetings at or around the registration desk. The reason that I do that is if they're not, I don't have to spend as much time as I used to digging through and saying, is this person registered? Is that person registered? They're either going to have the badge and can walk into the meeting space with me, or they're not. And if they don't, you're right there next to the registration desk. Maybe you need to go pay your registration fee. And for me, that's one of my pet peeves. I mean, granted, we were on the board for RMAI for a long time, and it's always kind of a challenge for various associations and private events. But I'm taking pictures of them and texting them to the event people, because it's just not it's not an appropriate behavior.
And
it's
I appreciate
you're going to benefit off of the association or the events
without supporting it.
Yeah.
To me, it's an easy right. At the end of the day, as somebody that sponsored these associations, right, be it through exhibiting or sponsoring, and without those sponsorships, without those exhibitors, these conferences wouldn't exist. And so, to me, it's disrespectful to them. It's disrespectful to the people that say, like, hey, we realize it's not a $10 ticket to get in. But again, as a now event organizer, it's our responsibility to ensure that those two things are being delivered on. And in my instance, it's education and meaningful network interactions. So
edutainment, I believe, is the phrase that you have coined through the years.
It's not I didn't coin it. That's an old KRS-One line. But yes, I have definitely mentioned it more than a few times. But it's important, I think, to circle back to what you were talking about, right, which is Las Vegas versus destination location. I think that it comes back to that delicate balance between engaging with your attendees and making them want to attend a new location, a new place. Mexico, for example, right? Or be that, or any of the kind of regional events that have taken place in the past, whether it's a 100-person sports event or it's a regional fundraiser for a particular bill, or something that's taking place on the federal level, potentially we've attended. It really comes down to exposure. And I think the more you can attend, the more you're out there, and the more you're meeting with these people that are likewise attending these shows, I think the better chance you have of making new and different business connections.
So one thing that I've heard a lot recently is people asking me, how do they make the business case for attending a particular show, right? Without, I don't have the attendee list. How am I supposed to make a business case as a salesperson to my executive team that I should be allowed to attend this? And so here's one of the things that I really wanted to point out here. I'm going to kind of run down the slide a little bit. Is the last minute is corporate speak for wasting money. Right? Those organizations, if you're not going to plan out in advance going to a show, you are not maximizing the value that you should be able to get. I'm not saying don't go. I'm just saying you're not going to get the same out of it that you would when you start pre-planning. I don't know when you open your calendar, Mark, but for RMAI every year, I open my calendar on December 1st. You're talking 60 plus days out, right? Starting to book. Go ahead. I know you got thoughts on this one.
I got a lot because on one hand, my 20 years, I sometimes would dread these meetings because in January or in December, we would sit down and it would not just be one or two people. Right. It's okay. General counsel's going to NCBA and these three people are going to RMAI and this person's going to do the DCS one and this person's going to do CRS. And I think that for me, yes, I was always one to try and at least put something into place at the beginning of the year to avoid these last minute situations, because you're 100% right. Oftentimes, right, prices go up. You miss out on room blocks and things like that. I will also tell you that I think if you polled the association professionals in this space, I think especially post-corona, I think that you've got a tremendous number of companies that are focusing on one show at a time. And it versus in the past where you had kind of a longer tail to plan. I'm finding in my experience that even 30 days away from DCS, and I've got people like my email is boop, 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 while we're on this call. So yes, I agree. Better planning, right? Proper planning leads to, you know, a better
where preparation meets opportunity, right? There's a real opportunity when you prepare in advance. I mean, we do the beginning of the year, we lay everything out. We say, these are the conferences we intend to go to this year. And I usually even go as far as to book all of my flights in January for the entire year. Now, I mean, that helps when you fly with one airline and you get a little bit more flexibility without change fees and things, or you're flying Southwest or however your corporation works. But I spend significantly less on my travel and all of my flights because I booked them so far in advance, and I never ride a middle seat, right? Like I'm exit row all the way. And it, for me, that makes a difference if you're going to be traveling every other week throughout the year, right? Especially during the short bursts of what I'm going to call conference seasons, beginning of the year, end of summer, and then you've got that like end of September, early October stretch of conferences. But if you book all of that stuff in advance, you can execute on these things at a significantly lower rate. Now, you may not go book all your hotel rooms yet, right? You're waiting for the room blocks to open and those kinds of things, and that's fine. But getting that travel out there, I mean, I want to say probably saved me $15,000 this year in flight expenses total. Like when you start adding it up across all the people that are traveling, it really does make a difference. But even beyond that, it's about who's going to be available, right? If you start reaching out to me 5 days before an event, my calendar's not open, right? Like there's not as many opportunities for us to sit down and have those discussions. Now, if you reached out to me 30, 45 days in advance, there's probably some times that we can shift things around and try and make something work. But I mean, is your calendar not full, 5 days before the event? I mean, it's a little bit harder for you to be able to execute on the value proposition.
And one step further than that, it's not just about optimizing, it's about basic functionality sometimes, because sometimes the entire hotel is sold out. And now the only hotel you can get to is quite an Uber drive away. And now you're Ubering back and forth. And all of the reservations for like dinners are completely booked up. And now you're like, okay, well, where am I going to go to eat? So especially when you have a venue that's more isolated, that becomes a huge issue. That might not be a huge issue in Vegas. There's hundreds of hotels, there's hundreds of restaurants, but talking about Santa Fe again, there weren't that many options. Or even if we talk about the Aria at RMAI, if you're not aware that there's only one place for breakfast and how to plan around that and how to work through that, you can get in a lot of trouble by waiting last minute and not having your reservations and not planning for your hotel, for your flights. It could be terrible.
You end up spending a bunch of money to host breakfast in your suite is generally what ends up happening if I don't have that reservation in
as
advance.
a conference organizer, I would simply ask you, why aren't you eating breakfast with the conference?
Because the understanding of the value of my time. As we go into our next slide here, meals are the primary value of uninterrupted time for me. And so I may go down and eat the hotel food, but chances are I'm looking for an opportunity to isolate a specific discussion that should be had in private. And I look at, for me, the most valuable pieces of time that I have at the conference is going to be during those meals. That's my uninterrupted time. That's the time where I don't have, look, if you just stand there and talk to people, you're giving high fives, you're shaking, you're giving the head nod 200 times during a discussion in an open area. But my uninterrupted time is the most valuable time for me at any given conference. That's just me. I know other people look at it in different ways, but my next most valuable piece of time is those networking events. So if I don't have a meal planned, and a lot of times, Mark, I might plan two. Right? I plan to be at that networking lunch because that's a prime time opportunity to be in the conference hall. And it's also when a lot of the booths are manned. So if I want to go around and I want to learn about the different products and services that different organizations are offering, like that's a good time for me to go and engage with those people at the booth, because the opening receptions, right, like those evening receptions tend to be a little bit more of a social hour and you're catching up with all the people that you kind of already know. It's a little bit more difficult. It's a little more crowded. I find those breakfast breakfast and lunch opportunities in the exhibit hall to be a great opportunity to actually engage with those exhibitors and get a better feel for what's new for them, what kind of products and services are you bringing to the marketplace, and keep me on the forefront of the changes that are ultimately happening around the space.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts, Mark? I could see I'm
Oh,
winding
no,
him up again.
I agree with what you're saying, right? And I think that an important thing that we kind of skipped over here, and it's something that I've had a lot more experience with now, having taken over the conferences. And one of those things, and look, as somebody that exhibited at not just RMAI, but at CRS, at the show I'm now running, for the better part of like 15, 16, 17 years, I can tell you I didn't realize that you really have two, and I realize I'm being a little stereotypical, or I'm kind of encapsulating a little too simply, but you really have people that are really extroverted, kind of like you, Adam. You're not a shy guy at a conference. You're willing to raise your eyebrows or say like, hey, what do you do? What do you do? But I think that there's another segment of conference population, especially people that work for larger companies that are perhaps coming to a show for the first time, that don't have that same extroverted nature. And I've heard it as complaints from people that are like, well, people aren't coming up to my booth, or, for people that aren't able to engage with attendees in a positive way. I remember, and it was one of these shows, somebody, a keynote speech where they were just talking about like eyebrow raise and like, hey, what do you do? Hey, my name is Mark. I realized that it seems so simple and so basic. But here's one of those great examples of where I don't think there's a all-in-one solution that fits every conference attendee. You really have to be mindful of these experiences for those that are extroverted, that can walk from one side of the hall and high five and slap everyone on the back. But that's not everyone at the show. And it's important as an organizer to understand that, and to either, I don't want to say force, but one of the things that used to happen at DCS all the time was like a speed networking. They call it speed dating. Everyone has 30 seconds or a minute. There's 50 people that stand around and they all hand out cards. There's some people that love that. I did it once or twice. For me, it was always difficult because, like you said, I had a meeting every 15 minutes. I was running from the sports book back out to the lobby, over to the smoking section, back to the sports book, back to the conference hall, back to registration desk. And so it was difficult for me to do that because I was way more focused on my business opportunities. And so it really comes down to defining, like you said in these past slides, what does that conference experience look like to you? And what are all the various different ways that you can capitalize on that? And I know I keep kind of pushing the slide.
You bring up some really good points there. And I think the number one piece of advice that I can give to exhibitors right now is get your head out of your phone. Because when you're sitting there and you're doing this the whole time, there's a reason I'm not walking up and saying hello. You're not inviting, you're not engaging with anything that's going on around you. And look, at any show that I walk around, more than half of the booth people that are working the individual booths are head in the phone or sending emails or not. And during and I understand between the networking events, fine, right? Like we all got a business to run. Like I definitely understand that. But during those networking events, if you're head down, like of course nobody's coming up and talking to you. Get your head out of your phone.
And get outside of your booth even. Just, it's almost like a barrier sometimes with that big table. Sometimes stand outside of it or walk around, introduce yourself to your neighbors even. And
we always slide our table to the side, right? You don't want to create a separation.
Yeah. And another great thing to capitalize on is anyone who does like the dinner with strangers events, things like that. Huge. That's fantastic. Especially it helps people who are quieter get out of their shell. Because you've got a small group of people and you're having dinner together. It's that optimal time, but it was put together for you to be able to make those introductions. It's great to capitalize on that.
That's a great example of that forced type of interaction that you never know what it could lead to, right? But that's a fantastic kind of point out there, Kat. Yeah, that's funny. Bendy used to forbid us sitting down during exhibit hall hours. Like he would threaten to take the chairs away. And he's right to some extent. Until he's sitting down, he's going to kill me for bringing that up. Be like, oh, my leg hurts. I can sit. You guys have to sit. Laura would agree with me there. So
I completely understand.
There's a certain truth to that. I can think of guys in the space that are still here, that are still salespeople in the space that still have that charisma, and regardless of what company they're working at, I'm walking directly up to them to shake their hand and find out what's going on.
So Kat's dropping a good question in here that I think we can address. Any tips or recommendations on how to balance making new connections versus nurturing old connections in existing relationships? And I kind of alluded to this. I'm going to kind of throw my, my mind frame into this, and then I want to hear your thoughts as well. For me, it's designated time. I use the opening receptions for existing relationships and the kind of the walk around, catch up with the people that I know. We're having a drink. It's a little bit more social. That's generally when I'm using that time. The other networking events, the breakfast, the lunches, the breaks, even when there's going to be a session break, I always try to make sure it's on my calendar and that I'm going down to the hall. And that's when I'm looking at new relationships. And whether that's walking through, in talking to the exhibitors, or whether that is just connecting with somebody, dropping a comment as we're walking out of an individual education session. Hey, what'd you think of or hey, I never really thought of it in that perspective before. That was interesting. And just starting a conversation in that way. And then as you start moving later into the evening, I'm generally trying to do a dinner either with somebody that I know. And if I'm doing that, I try and add a couple of people. And we did that at RMAI this year because Kat had executed on an absolutely perfect dinner over at the Mayfair. And as I was walking out of the exhibit hall, there were two different attorneys that I had never really spent any time with before. I knew their names, but didn't know them, and said, hey, we got this dinner going on. Why don't you come and join us? Now I'm texting back and forth with them. We're talking about all kinds of different things, both business and personal, because if you have that opportunity and you have it in your budget to just include one or two more people, you'd be surprised how quickly you can make some new friends.
And to piggyback off of that, I often make it a practice to add at least one, if I can, 2 extra reservations. There's 4 of us. You know what? I'm going to make a reservation for 6 just in case we get an opportunity like that. You meet a fantastic person. So if you can, like you said, in your budget, make room for that. Try to, because it's amazing the people you meet. And also, to speak to this from somebody who is still very new to the industry, I use walking around the exhibit hall as a huge way to do kind of both, because I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to find here. I want to hit every single booth. What do you do? What do you do? I want to gain as much information as I can. And at that same time, you're hitting booths of people you're good friends with, or and so it's a great way to just kind of hit all of that at once by just walking through. And another thing I've started to do is, if I see somebody who I do know, run over, say hi, and oftentimes you'll get an introduction to the people that they're with that you didn't know, and you get a chance to do 2 birds, 1 stone right there.
Mark, any thoughts on kind of striking the balance between the new relationships and maintaining your existing ones?
I think most of the comments are going to come back down to if we're evaluating this just kind of in a vacuum, and you're a single person attending one show, I think it becomes more difficult. If we're talking about the situation where you've got a few people, like in your case, Adam, when you bring in multiple team members out there, again, kicking forward a slide, the concept of I may have been 2 slides, my apologies, but it's that concept of divide and conquer, right? And your ability to properly sit back and say, okay, look, we've got a limited number of things to do. The longer you have to plan for these things, the more effective they become, whether it's the Mayfair dinner. I can think of events that I did. We did Dig This in Vegas a couple of times. Everyone got in tractors and stuff, and it was a small group of people. It was about
shared experience.
Well, here we are 15 years later, and every time I talk to these guys at the bank, they're like, you still out there? What are you doing now? And it just becomes that kind of extra little bit of fun that's a little outside of what your true wheelhouse is, and it lets you have a little, cut your hair loose a little. I don't have much hair, so I can't use that analogy, but you know what I'm talking about. But I truly think that that's it. That's how you balance it, is that you have to be able to plan, and I think you dedicate those times that are, I mean, to me, I'm setting up meetings when my business prospects have availability. So, right, I'm moving that around versus the time I have to go check out a new vendor seems like a perfect time for a cocktail reception or for in between sessions or a break or something of that nature. And like I said, flip that around on its head. If you're a creditor and you're coming to a show, you're probably going to be more interested in some other various opportunities, whether it's the education, whether it's very specific vendors, whether it's implementing a new letter company, some new AI, something in that collections technology realm, or for that matter, a new agency, a new buyer. So understanding where everyone and why everyone else is also attending is an important part of being able to plan appropriately.
So I want to go back to the divide and conquer here for a minute, because it's a great point, especially if you have multiple resources that are attending a show. And I've approached this differently with different team members when I've had them at shows. And so Katalina and I do it a little bit differently than when it was, just Leah and I going to shows. And I think most of the people on this watching us right now are familiar with the people. But like Katalina and I have different time blocks in which we are on point. I'm great into the night. Catalina's a morning person. And so our divide and conquer is she's down there working the breakfast when I might show up. I might be dragging in there a little bit because I was out with the late night crew and building those relationships and trying to find those opportunities. So I think there's kind of that approach. We've also taken an approach where when we've brought kind of our content writers and other people to the shows, where I'm off doing the individual meetings and then they're coming to a couple of key meetings where I really want to introduce them. And then they're spending the rest of their time in the education sessions to kind of learn those pieces and parts of the business. And then we're meeting at the end of every day, and definitely at the end of the conference, to do a debrief where everybody brings their notebook, everybody has their. And for those of you that know me, I always have the little notebook in my pocket, right? Because I don't want to be taking notes on my phone and looking like I'm texting somebody else when you truly have my undivided attention. But we always come back together and make sure that we're doing an information share at the end of it. I always will if I see 2 or 3 people from the same company sitting together at a networking thing, I always walk up to them and say, "Oh, that's so cute. You guys, you got your Thunder buddies," because you really need to spread out. Like, you can't just all sit. Y'all work together already, especially if you're together in the same office. Let your Thunder buddy go and, go out there and go sit at 3 different tables and engage in 3 different conversations. Because if you don't go out and divide and conquer and you're just going to always walk around as 3, number one, you appear to be more intimidating to someone who's not aware of you or doesn't know you, because you're always moving in a group. It's like in high school when you're trying to ask a girl out. If she's always with her, her clique, it's a lot harder to start that conversation than someone who's kind of, out on their own.
And it's hard. It can be really, really hard to be just out on your own and introducing yourself, especially if you're somebody who's more introverted. But sometimes the best way to get better at it is by doing it. Just jump in with 2 feet. There was one time with my previous company, we had a cancellation last minute. I believe the salesperson got sick and they're like, "Who else can go?" And I was like, "I'm technically free, but I know nothing about like medical debt. I don't know, but I guess I'll go." And cut to the next day, I am in a place I've never been before with a bunch of people. I haven't met a single person there. And I was so nervous, like knee shaking nervous. I'm like, these people know each other. I don't know anything. I don't even know anything about medical debt. And I just started walking up. "Hi, who are you? I'm this person." And as I went around, I got invited to dinners. I have people that I still talk to today who are wonderful friends. Like, just getting out there, putting yourself out there, it can make the biggest difference. And it's hard, but it will get easier with time. And by doing it, you'll build incredible connections.
I think it really does, start to create some opportunities. So I'm gonna go back those 2 slides since Mark wants to jump around.
I'm
here
sorry.
a little bit. Let's talk about the attendee list, and let's talk about I'm going to talk about the pitfalls of the attendee list here as well, because I think that look at who you're messaging before you send out mass emails. Right. I'm a marketing firm now. And when you email me about, wanting to represent my debt, I'm block. It's spam. Like, stop it. Like, at least look at it and make sure that the people that you're messaging are of the right persuasion to ultimately be hearing and wanting to hear your message, because otherwise you just look like you don't know what you're doing. Personally, I like to go with the targeted approach for individual emails, right? So I find those targets that I think are most important to me and I send out individual emails. Now, that email may have some sort of a templated base from my CRM, but I'm individually selecting and I'm spending a few hours prior to the show. If I'm going to invest $10,000, $15,000 in going to a show, I might as well invest an hour or two in doing an appropriate and direct outreach instead of just marketing team, send a message. That's not helping you, right? You really need to dig into that and make sure that you're sending the message to the right people. Like, take the time to manually review it. Take the time to understand who these people are and what these organizations do before you just start blanket messaging everybody. It's just something you really got to consider. Now, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I recently shared something on LinkedIn, which I thought was a great visual of this. If you treat everybody, I love the term cluster. So you're just clustering all of your potential customers, all your current customers together, and you think they all want the same thing. It's like pouring a ton of ping pong balls down a staircase and trying to get them into a cup. None of them are going to go in there because there's no target there. You're just throwing things on the wall and seeing what's going to stick. So there is a huge difference when you put in that little bit of personalization and you actually pay attention to who you're talking to and why you should be talking to them. It's massive.
So since we've talked about some of these other things in terms of the venue and the facility, here's the next one I wanted to talk about was the exhibit preparation. And so when you're going to be exhibiting, and I can tell you, like, I have failed at this in the past. This is not the Adam strong suit, but fortunately I'm not alone. And I've got Katalina, who has completely changed kind of my perspective on what we do to prepare with her checklists and organization and pre-ordering of swag. I feel like I'm never in a rush anymore as it relates to a show, because we're looking at these things 60, 90 days out and not having to worry about how many stress balls we have, 5 days before the show. And can we get some emergency shipped out to rush FedEx to the venue? So Kat, talk to us a little bit about kind of what your process is as you're prepping for an event.
Well, that begins with the pre-planning of, in December, we're talking about what are all the events we're going to this year. And from there, I look at the dates for those events. Okay, how soon in advance for RMAI should I be planning? Well, it's December, we're already planning. So I would say 2 months is pretty much the minimum of when you want to start planning for an event. But sometimes things open up 3-4 months ahead of time. And if they have any dates of when the room block is going to be open, when registration opens, write them down. Have them in your calendar, have them in, I personally use Asana as a task manager. So I'll just pop them in there and then the date comes up and I know, okay, I can register everybody right now and have everybody on early discounts, things like that. So just getting all of that pre-planning ramped up. And that goes hand in hand with paying attention to shipping dates and all of those sorts of items. How soon does the shipping start? When does the shipping end? When does it need to get to the venue? And then you can pre-plan outbound shipping. There is nothing like the scramble of being at the event and going, we didn't plan to ship this out. So having that done, I like to get the outbound shipping done when I'm doing the inbound shipping so that all the shipping is just, it's nice and clean, a little box taken care of, shipping done, check. And then thinking ahead with swag, depending on what vendor you use, can take months to get the proper swag. And then also another reason why I love walking exhibit halls is seeing what everybody's doing, trying to see what swag works, what are people interested in, what is an entire table full of because nobody is interested in. Let's probably not order any of that because it seems to not be working. So paying attention to that, and then catering your swag to what works and to what the event is. I talk about this all the time when we do podcasts and webinars if we talk about swag. But when I went to a medical debt conference, I came up with the idea of having like they're pill bottles, and it was a prescription for our product, and you opened it up and it had a little piece of paper that said your symptoms are, listing all of the problems you could be facing, and flip it over. Then we recommend you try our product. And then side effects include all the benefits of it. And it was just so tailored to that audience, and it drew a lot of attention. People really loved it. So paying attention to what you're going to and ordering things for that specifically. If you're doing auto finance, you can have a little car. It's very fun. So paying attention to that and paying attention to the lead times for the swag, because now your swag's going to arrive. You order it, it's going to take a month, but then you also have to pay attention to the shipping date after that of when it needs to get to the venue. Can you pack it with your booth? There's so many aspects to it. And I suggest making a list, having a checklist, have a template, be able to write everything down, because it's going to change per event. And you don't want to be left behind going, well, we didn't pack any swag at this event, or our outbound shipping isn't set. We don't have a bill of lading or anything. So checklist,
And
checklist.
if you're going to update your booth, give yourself like 90 days. I can't tell you look, RMAI is at the same time every year, and I can't tell you how many people call me mid-January saying, I'd really like to do a booth refresh before RMAI. That's not realistic. Like that no. But besides the fact that you have to then design this thing, get it approved through your whole organization or whatever your approval process is, you're talking two weeks to print. You're talking another week or two to ship, depending on how much money you want to spend. But again, lack of preparation is expensive, and that's just kind of compounds. So if you really, take a look at your booth now and say, what do I want for 2025? It's time to start thinking about those things now, so that you can start getting all that material and that messaging organized in a way in which you can actually leverage it and use it for value. And do some pre-show promotion. Don't just show up like, I'm here. Right? You got to kind of start that off. We always start with some social media posts. Hey, we're going to be at DCS, first week of October. Let's connect. There's some opportunities there. Even if I'm not setting direct meetings through that type of social post, I'm creating awareness of our attendance. And we may use some emails, whether that be larger emails where we're going out after a larger group, after manually going through the list and finding those specific targets that make sense. And in order to get that list, you're generally going to have to be in it. If you want to do pre-show promotions, you're going to have to be an exhibitor and or a sponsor in order to get access to that list. And don't just go and get the list from your friends, because you're going to make mistakes. Right? Like, don't just start sharing the list and sending it out to everybody, because it's not that hard to figure out who did it. So many people getting caught doing that through the years, but make sure that you're reaching out to the right people. And if you're going to go and get the list and you want to do this kind of pre-show promotion, do a sponsorship, right? Sponsor a lunch. Exhibit at the show. If you don't want to have a booth, there's so many different opportunities. Reach out to the organization, check out their prospectus, right? There's so many different options. And then there's creative options too, right? Like, I know it's CRS every year now. There's the Shoe Shine booth, and there's just so many different unique and interesting opportunities. And I'm going to use the Shoe Shine booth as an example, because now you've got a potential customer sitting there for 2 to 3 minutes. Right? They're there. There's an opportunity to engage. You've got a captive audience for a few minutes and looking at those new and creative ways, right? Or if you're trying to create awareness, Branding Arc and Receivables Info are sponsoring the registration booth at DCS this year, because we want to draw awareness to Catalina's podcast, talking about all different kinds of really subjects related to growing your career. I want to be promoting my podcast and kind of that transition from receivables podcast and over to the others. And ask Sylvia, perfect point. Ask the organizer if they're open to custom sponsorships. I've seen X before, right? I was at the auto show when I saw this, but reaching out and having those conversations, I think, is incredibly opportunistic. And Sylvia personally is one of the most creative people I've met through the years in terms of finding new ways to engage and to provide opportunity for those vendor members, right? Those affiliate members to be recognized, to be noticed, and there's opportunity there.
I wanted to say real quick, I actually did this with Mark before I really knew Mark. It was one of the first things we did together, because I was an event manager, and I called you and I said, hey, I see there's like a welcome gift. And you're like, yeah, so we'll source something, you pay, here's how it kind of works. And I said, well, what if
I already have something in mind, and I already have somebody who, a printer who can do it. What if I just do it all for you, have it shipped to you and like ready and go? And he's like, yeah, all right, we're going to change up
Yeah.
this.
And I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because unfortunately, and a testament to your talents as a marketing person, that's kind of the exception to the rule. But as Sylvia points out, as a conference organizer, look, a big challenge is always making sure that you're not handing out something that isn't in line with expectations or with that level of experience that you're trying to deliver on. And so more often than not, for example, everyone's
No hammer multi-tools.
No, but it's that, like the cheapest pen available through Vistaprint.
Yeah.
Like that's not a handout. And in Kat's instance, it was something I had never seen at a show. It was something that I had never handled. And no, Sylvia, the worst was the wine openers with the giant like 7-inch knife in Monterey, just for the record. But we'll get back to that one. But in Kat's instance, right, these mobile phone holders were not something that I had ever seen at a show. Look, speaking plainly, I don't think I have one on my desk, but right, the executive retreat, they were handing out Game Boys. They were handing out Game Boys at the most recent executive summit, which I thought was a very cool and different giveaway. And that's it. At the end of the day, people like free stuff, and that's not the reason they're going to the show, but it reminds you, like, oh, I got that at that show. There's something that creates that memorable experience. And when Kat was so easily able to deliver on something that I had never seen before, it just makes perfect sense. And every organizer is willing to work with those that are exceptionally creative.
My personal favorite was the Maui gyms at the executive summit in, where were we?
Sedona.
And the reason
twice.
And one of the reasons it was my favorite is for the next, I'm going to call it 12 to 18 months, I'd go to a show, I'd see somebody that I knew was at that event wearing Maui gyms, and that conversation continued, right? Like you all of a sudden saw like the whole industry wearing Maui gyms, and we all knew where they came from, and it created this kind of like camaraderie, I guess you could call it. But it did open a lot of conversations over the coming 18 months for me personally. And I thought that was a really good, very usable, very, I still have them. I'm not wearing them today, but I still have them. And that for me, I think is one of those really important ones. As we're coming down to our final 7 minutes, and I feel like this is a topic we could literally talk about all day long. But calendar management is like my big pet peeve here. One, make sure that you got it on the right time zone. Just make sure you got it on the right time zone. I can't tell you how many times last minute, I didn't know it was, Central Time. I thought New Orleans was on the East Coast. No, it's not. Use the internet. Google will help you, right? Your calendar will help you. And sending out a calendar invite and making sure that you're actually on somebody's calendar and they're on your calendar is a great way to avoid those kinds of situations. So I'm a stickler for those. I like to use Calendly for that kind of booking too, because in using the Calendly platform, it actually texts them 10 minutes before. So I have it scheduled that if you book a meeting with me, you're getting a text message, call it 10, 15 minutes before. And the I forgot we had a meeting excuse is out the door, because I'm not doing a second meeting if you forgot we had a meeting. For me, it's just a sign of disrespect. I call it what it is, but give yourself some in transit time when you're booking these every half-hour meetings. Make sure that everybody realizes it's really a 25-minute meeting, because you need 5 minutes to like actually step away and go to the next one. And if your book gets really full, make sure you give yourself like a bathroom break in there occasionally, because otherwise you're going to end up pushing all your meetings back 5 or 10 minutes because you had to go get a bottle of water, take a restroom break or whatever. But that definitely is something that I spend a lot of time on. Any thoughts on the kind of scheduling aspects around conference attendance?
Not from, I wasn't going to talk about scheduling, but something huge that I want to mention before we wrap up is documentation, because I think this covers everything we've talked about the pre-planning. Is document what worked, what didn't work, even down to like, okay, you're shipping the booth. Say it's your first time shipping your booth. You might be like, oh, I don't know how big this booth is. Great, you got it in, you booked all your shipping. Did you write it down? Next time, are you going to have to go and try to figure out how big your booth is or how much it weighs and how? Write things down, write everything down, put it in the calendar. Because then say you make a reservation, you put the reservation down. Well, whose name of the company did you put it under? How many people was it for? Like, you could go up and have them listing off names. They're like, who is this reservation? Write things down, just documentation everywhere.
You make a great point about putting it in the calendar invite, because I find that to be a great way to do it. And if you're planning on doing social media posts or something at the conference, like put that on the calendar too. I was notorious for that over the past couple of years. Catalina has definitely reeled me in over the last year since joining Branding Arc, where on like during the opening reception, grab 3 friends and take a picture. Right. I will completely forget as I'm there socializing and having a good time. I'm feeling like I'm in my zone or in my element. And you kind of forget some of these simplistic things that really do make a difference, because not everybody attends the conference. If there's 10, 15,000 people in the space and you got 1,500 people at the conference, don't forget to communicate to the rest of them. Right. Just there's opportunity there as well. So I always do try and make it a point to be as active as I can from a social media standpoint while I'm actually on site. Consider the days that people are inbound and outbound from the conference and schedule yourself accordingly. And it doesn't always have to be during the show. You could take a couple of pictures and come up with some ideas, but we've even gotten to the point where I start prepping a lot of that material and even the written content to go with it well in advance, so that it's become a little bit more manageable to actually execute on those things in the heat of the moment. Ooh, and sending photos to the organizers to use in social media. That's a free advertising. Sylvia, we're going to go add that to our RMAI plan for this year, because you make a great point.
Fantastic point.
So from with just kind of 3 minutes left to go here, any final thoughts on tips or tricks that you would provide to our audience today about how they can get the most out of their upcoming conferences?
Final parting wisdom, and it'll actually answer a question that you asked 50 minutes ago that nobody answered, including myself, which was, how do you determine value out of a show? How do you determine that intrinsic monetary value? Our old motto was, right, if you get one good deal out of any show, it makes that show worthwhile. And I don't think that that's inaccurate, but I'll tell you, I think that as time has gone on, and a couple of things we didn't mention, we're kind of in an insulated industry. We're not in a bustling industry that's growing by 10,000 agencies and debt buyers per year. I think it's important to get out there. And what I mean by get out there, it's basically just kind of encapsulating everything we've talked about on the call today, including things like being at the booth. I know I was kind of making fun of Mike earlier, and like, you will stand here, and no joke, we had booth duty was on the calendar. Like, conferences are hard work. Downstairs at 7, you're not back upstairs to your room until probably after 10 o'clock if you're lucky. And in between that time, figuring out exactly your best plan is probably one of the hardest things. But whether it's, it's different for everyone, I can tell you that the best way you can capitalize on this is by bringing more than just one person and realizing that you don't all have to be in the same meetings. It's important. You can cover more ground with 2 people on site, especially if you have an exhibit booth and you want to host some meetings that are not potentially right in the public foray. So with that being said, you also have to have a memorable good time, because if you're not talking about the show afterwards, then the conference organizer, in a good way, then the conference organizer hasn't executed on what they're supposed to be doing. Well, I don't run across that much, and definitely not.
Sorry.
You're
I would
good.
say 2 last things to keep in mind when going to conferences. One is follow up. Follow up on any sales discussions you had, but also follow up with people you just met or people you have continuing relationships with. Just have that conversation continue going. The next thing would be try not to get sick. I am terrible. I get sick at like every other conference. Take your vitamin C. Something that has reduced me getting sick massively is if you just take, you've got those individual packed like disinfectant wipes, wipe down the airplane. The amount of times they clean the airplane is disgustingly low. So when you just wipe down your little, yes, liquid IVs too, 100% agree. I live by those when I'm traveling, but just wipe down your little spot on the airplane. When I started doing that, I get sick so much less. So just try not to get sick. Liquid IVs, get as much sleep as you can at these. And the last thing is just pushing that documentation again, documentation before, documentation during, and documentation after. So when you take good notes during the conference, your follow-ups are going to be so much better. When you document what went well at this event after it was over, or what didn't go well, what you can improve on, your next event is going to be so much better. So push that documentation.
I'm just going to pile on to what Kat said there about the documentation. And I know a lot of people like to take notes on their phone. I highly suggest against it when you're in a meeting. It looks like you're not paying attention. Get yourself a little $3 notebook, take actual notes, and provide yourself with an opportunity to follow up after the fact. You will find the value of your conference can be exponentially increased through a $3 expenditure.
Or if you're in a pinch and you don't have the notebook, grab the business card, write it on a business card real quick. Just jot it down.
If you don't have the notebook, tap me on the shoulder. I carry 3 or 4 at any given conference, just in case. But
Facts.
Running out of time for today, I really do thank everybody for your time and attention. This was a lot of fun getting to chat with some friends and share our experiences after traveling across this industry for the last almost 20 years. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you guys coming on. I appreciate your insights. I look forward to seeing you both at the Debt Connection Symposium Conference happening the first week of October in New Orleans at the Four Seasons. You can check receivablesinfo.com or debtconnection.com to get more information. And then we'll have the NCBA conference following up, also in New Orleans at the end of October. Different crowd, same city, and I think we'll have a lot of excitement there as well. Katalina and I will be co-hosting a party. There's nothing like a little live music, some food, some fun. I think we've got a great end of the year planned here. So thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll see y'all again soon.
Thank you.